I feel that really strongly with the footage we're getting from I Hope This Helps. It's very inspiring to watch so many people figuring things out or trying to figure things out. There are so many deep paradoxes in mental health of a sort of form that doesn't demand that you declare with complete black and white binary conviction, well, this is how it is very important, because that's not going to work in a field which is so complex. That's I guess what I find so kind of mesmerising about these films, is that you're assembling so much stuff that could feel very everyday. I find it incredibly exciting and exhilarating to watch.
You have found the Thinking Mind podcast.
Hello everyone, welcome back to the Thinking Mind podcast. Today it's Alex, and I'm really privileged to be presenting you with a conversation with Jack Arbuthnott. Jack is a producer and filmmaker, especially known for his crowdsourced documentaries Life in a Day and Life in a Day 2020. In this podcast we discuss his new documentary for the Wellcome Trust, I Hope This Helps, a crowdsourced documentary with a focus on mental health, where people from all around the world have been asked to submit hundreds of hours of footage, which will then be edited down to a feature film with the goal of giving people a glimpse of what mental health problems are like globally and what helps people during difficult times. The aim of the project is to make a beautiful film that creates change by sharing stories that help viewers through their own journey, by destigmatizing mental health in society, and by inspiring new research into things that can make a difference. Currently, the documentary is in the process of being made, and they're still requesting footage from the public. Therefore, if you think you have something to say about mental health, what you think helps, or you just want to share your story, you can go to hopethishelpsfilm.com. In particular, Jack was keen for submissions from people who actually work in mental health professionals, a lot of whom listen to the podcast. So definitely consider submitting some footage if you think you have something to say. I had a great conversation with Jack, and besides talking about I Hope This Helps, we also talked about the impact of some of his previous films, such as Life in a Day and Life in a Day 2020, which are still on YouTube, having garnered millions of views worldwide. We also talked a little bit about his path to becoming a film producer, some of his favourite films, what he thinks makes a compelling story, paradoxes within mental health, and what it's like to go to the Cannes Film Festival. To any new listeners, welcome. Here you can access in-depth conversations all about psychiatry, psychotherapy, psychology and self-development. To OG listeners, welcome back. If you'd like to support the podcast, check out the Buy Me a Coffee link in the description. And now here's our conversation with Jack Arbuthnott. Okay, welcome back everyone. Today on the podcast, I'm so pleased to be having a conversation with Jack Arbuthnott. Jack, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
You're making a film called I Hope This Helps.
So I Hope This Helps is a crowdsourced film. We're asking people from all over the world to share footage with us about how they manage their mental health, or if they'd like to talk a bit about their mental health journey.
What motivated you to make a film and make a documentary about mental health?
I was approached by Wellcome, who various people there had seen a film called Life in a Day and various successor films, which were these enormous crowdsourced films capturing all of human life on one day, start to finish. And there was a thought that maybe we could apply this model to mental health. And I guess when I began thinking about it, I was quite nervous. But the more I learned about the field, the more valuable I thought it might be as an experiment.
Maybe we could talk a little bit about Life in a Day and its successor, Life in a Day 2020. There are all sorts of spin-offs of those documentaries. They've got millions of views on YouTube. How did the idea for Life in a Day come about?
In 2009, YouTube were thinking about how to celebrate their 5th birthday, and they came to see us at Scott Free, Ridley Scott's production company, about a possible idea. So a very clever guy at YouTube called Tim Partridge had won a competition, and his sort of winning entry was this idea of making a film comprised of footage from YouTube. We approached the director, Kevin MacDonald, and I guess figured out, how it could be done. It was sort of the early days of not many people had camera phones at that time, but we received, I think, 4,500 hours of footage, all taken on this one day, July the 24th, 2010, and then over the next 6 months. Put together this really, I think, very moving and beautiful film about everyday life with wonderful music, kind of very clever sound design, and lots of filmmaking techniques were applied to the footage we received, and it then premiered at the Sundance Film Festival in January 2011, and was distributed in various sort of countries and cinemas around the world, and then in the following July, so a year on from the filming day, was launched on YouTube, and it's been there ever since, and it's been a sort of hugely popular, quite different film.
And so the film chronicles really everyday life from people all around the world, and it goes chronologically right from the morning through to the night.
Yeah, that's right. There's obviously lots of ways that one could tackle it, but in all of the films, we've chosen to start at the beginning of the day, or start at midnight and end in the following day. Seems to be, it's obviously a structure that we're quite familiar with, a narrative structure that we, all live. So we've made a number of films in this way, and you tend to get different sort of thematic groupings. So you might, before lunchtime, have a section about love. There are plenty of different ways to do it, but they have all thus far been structured around the day.
Mm-hmm.
You tend to get a few kind of standout stories, maybe characters who you meet earlier on and then revisit. Lots of it is just tiny little glimpses into the world of different people all over the world. So that was 2010, and as you said, we've done a number of different kind of follow-ups: Britain in a day, Japan in a day, India in a day, Germany in a day, Italy in a day. So lots of on a kind of country basis. There was one called Springsteen and I, about being a Springsteen fan, and then we did a sequel to Life in a Day in 2020, which was during the pandemic. That was the biggest one by far. We had 324,000 clips. We had more kind of varied footage geographically. I think that's to do with the way that the smartphone has, penetrated every corner of the world. So many more people have cameras now, and it's really interesting to compare the world then to the world in which we made Life in a Day, 2010. We noticed people talking about loneliness much more, which we didn't really notice at all in 2010. We did a little bit.
So people were largely in lockdown in Life in a Day 2020?
Well, it doesn't actually, watching it back, it doesn't feel like they were, but yes, there was a lot of lockdown in July 2020, but certainly the whole planet wasn't all, at home. There's quite a lot going on that. That's, I guess, what I find so kind of mesmerising about these films, is that you're assembling so much stuff that could feel very banal, and it's very everyday, by definition. But I find it incredibly exciting and exhilarating to watch.
What do you think you find it exhilarating about it?
That's a really good question. I don't really know, but I think it might be that I find these films very reassuring, and I think that's because this could just be me, that lots of the sort of dominant narratives in the media culturally paint a picture of a world in which things are very sensationalized. And I don't know if you've ever had this thing whenever I've had any direct experience of a news event, I've always sort of, you always notice this thing where the telling of what's happened feels out of whack with what that really happened, and meditating on what human beings actually get up to day to day, to me, paints quite a different picture that is very kind of moving. I get very moved by it. I think it's often very inspiring. It's often very difficult to watch or sad. But there's something I feel more optimistic for our species when I contemplate the world in the way that these films ask you to contemplate it. And I think there's a kind of authenticity to these films that's quite kind of valuable, precious.
Yeah, there's something grounding about getting in touch with maybe the universality of human experience, and maybe seeing human experience through a more realistic and less sensationalized, as you said, less sensationalized lens. Because I guess classically, let's say in the majority of the 20th century, you would need some sort of major broadcasting machinery to even produce something sensational, like to make a film or to put something on television. But now everyone has the ability to sensationalize their own lives within their pockets. So even the way you construct your Instagram story and post regular updates about how your life is going, everyday people have the tools to even sensationalize that and to put a highlight reel of their life online. And I think there is a sort of growing consensus that it's really, really unhealthy, because human beings have such a pronounced tendency to compare themselves to other people, that if everyone's putting out this image of a very idealistic and idealized version of their lives, that it's going to create a superhighway into depression and anxiety, and a feeling that somehow they're not good enough or doing a good enough job at life. But then seeing the everydayness in films like yours is a very grounding experience.
That sounds very plausible. Yeah. We see it actually in a lot of the comments, and that one of the things people feel after watching the films is connected to other people. And we think that particularly the films seem to have had a disproportionate effect on younger audiences. And you'll often, read comments like, I've never felt more connected before. And it was quite stark, this sense we got in 2020 of a more kind of urgent need to feel connected, which could be attributed exclusively to the pandemic, but I suspect wasn't just that.
Do you get the sense that we live in a less connected world nowadays? Less, socially connected?
Bringing it back to social media, I don't know. There are some senses in which social media connects us in ways that we've never been connected before. But in other ways, it feels like we probably are living less, in a less connected way. I don't know.
Something that I worry about is that the ways that we use to connect to each other, although undeniably useful, leave a lot of room to spark fantasy and living in a fantasy life. Like, I talked to Ian McGilchrist, who wrote a book called The Master and His Emissary. I spoke to him a couple of years ago, and he expressed that he feels we're kind of living in a simulacrum, which I think I understand his rationale for saying that. But I also think, technology aside, we have an enormous capacity to live in a world of thought and fantasy. And even something simple like a WhatsApp thread, which isn't a very sophisticated technology as technology goes. Let's say a group WhatsApp thread where you have 5 people constantly communicating in community with each other. The fact that you're only getting a very narrow band of communication, which is verbal, with no tonality, with no facial expression, with no touch, it allows for your mind to fill in all the gaps, and you don't realize necessarily that your mind is filling in the gaps, but it is, and it's filling them with assumptions, projections, your own insecurities. Everything goes into that vacuum. And often if people are predisposed to feeling anxious or depressed, I can see how that would amplify that mechanism, and all of a sudden you have a lot of dysfunction, because it groups in general that there's so much room for conflict, of course, and for difficulties. And I can see how it's even just taking a lot of the aspects of communication which we take for granted out of the equation leaves room for dysfunction to fill in the vacuum.
Are you saying that we're simply not very well equipped to deal with these new communication methods?
Yeah, I mean, I think our brains weren't designed for it, and they were never designed with the idea that these technologies would come about. And so I think a lot of problems that we're facing in a modern era result from a mismatch between our ancestral environment and our current environment. So the obvious example is food, which I talked about on another podcast recently, which we tend to think about tendency, for example, to binge foods containing a lot of sugar or fat or salt as dysfunctional. But it's not. It's actually incredibly adaptive and functional in an ancestral environment where those foods are incredibly rare. And our brain was simply never designed to cope in an environment where calories aren't going to be an issue. And actually the foods filled with salt, fat and sugar, not only are they more available, they're the most available, because as it turns out, they're the easiest to produce en masse, they're the easiest to keep preserved for a long period of time. And so we're made to almost feel like we're in some way not good enough, and we're somehow morally reprehensible, or we lack willpower. But the truth is, our brains were designed to gorge ourselves on these foods if we ever came across them, for very good reasons relating to survival. Because if you found those foods in an ancestral environment, that increase your survivability, because they're packed with energy, and energy was definitely not something. Energy from food sources wasn't something you could necessarily easily rely on in an ancestral environment. And I think social media is the same, in that we're just being presented with information, and especially social information, which we treat very importantly, in such a different medium. In a sense, you could say it's very high volume, low nutritional information, if you like. A lot of information about things that are happening, often negative things that you absolutely have no control over. And if it's one thing that makes human beings unhappy, it's to be given negative information about bad things that are happening that they have no efficacy or ability to control. And you have that happening more than ever before, and you can do it all day, and you can check your phone all day, and we're all subtly and overtly addicted to these things, I think.
What do you feel we should be doing differently?
I think it's hard for me to get prescriptive about it, but clearly I think it's easier for me to talk about it on an individual level than on a sociological level. I think whenever you encounter something new that you clearly have a vulnerability towards, say, what does a human being encounter throughout their lives? A human being can encounter love, sex, conflict, aggression, the dangers of technology, the dangers of food, the dangers of drug and alcohol, the dangers of excessive comfort, the dangers of power, all of these things. If you recognize that you have a predisposition towards something, that something can become overly seductive, you have to learn how to manage it. So when it comes to technology and social media, there's clearly a place for each individual trying to realize to what extent is this technology helping me? Because obviously it's very helpful in many ways. You and I can have this conversation, and then within a few clicks of a button, thousands of people around the world can listen to it, and that's obviously amazing. So to what extent is it helping?
Lucky them.
To what extent is it helping? To what extent is it holding me back? Which requires a lot of introspection, I think, because I think many people are probably addicted to these technologies without realizing it. But then once you realize and you have a grasp of the problem, taking very practical and often quite firm steps to insulating yourself a little bit and getting in touch more with real life and real social connections. I think we often look for very majestic answers that solve all of our problems very quickly. And in my experience in psychotherapy, both me, a client, and a therapist, the answers are often very unsexy and not glamorous, and they revolve around small, consistent, incremental changes over time, and the exercise of discipline and eventually habit to learn how to manage these quite insidious forces in our lives, really. And the sooner you can start to realize what the effect it's having and start to exercise some control, I think the better we'll all be for it. But I mean, one of the problems is it's all a bit abstract, which is why I think talking about it explicitly in conversations like these is very helpful.
I'm doing this project, Zoe. Do you know about that?
Yeah.
And I've become one of these, I think we call Zoe bores, because that's all I can talk about. I've been kind of gripped by feeling I'm part of this enormous collective. It's helping me enormously understand what food does to my body and how different people have quite different profiles that should have a bearing on, how you eat and so on.
So what does Zoe do, and how does it help you understand the impact of food better?
Well, so initially you do these tests. You eat standardized muffins. You wear a blood sugar monitor for 2 weeks.
Do they taste good, at least?
The muffins are the most repulsive things I've ever eaten. It was agony. 50 minutes of misery. And then you do stool tests, blood tests, and a few weeks later you're sent back your Zoe scores. Okay, I think, as I understand it, the basic premise is that we are all quite different. So how one person reacts to fats and sugars can be quite different from another, and so it feels very different from didactic dieting axioms where you're told you need to do X, Y, and Z in order to achieve this. Whereas this is a sort of set of emerging learnings about correlations between different habits, like the number of plants you eat in your diet, or the gaps between meals, all these various things. And so I had this sense of hundreds of thousands of people kind of fumbling around in a way, trying to collectively learn a bit and make improvements. And I keep being struck by the similarities there with the footage that we're receiving for I Hope This Helps, which is mostly people kind of saying, well, this is what worked for me, or this is what hasn't worked for me, or this is what I've tried, or you need to try this and you then need to try that. And it's obviously really striking, just the extent to which so many of the same ideas and themes and treatments appear, unsurprisingly, but also how custom, and probably quite, lonely, people on sort of these individual journeys. And I just wonder, do you think there's a kind of, do you think these two fields have something, have things in common? That's what I feel.
The fields of nutrition and and mental health.
Yeah.
I think there are often parallels between what's happening in our body physically and physiologically and what's happening psychologically. I've looked into nutrition quite deeply in my career because I think it's really important, nutrition and exercise, and tackling the obesity crisis, which is, as far as I can tell, worse than it's ever been. I think the main parallels I can think of spontaneously are that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to mental health or to nutrition. So everyone needs, or everyone can benefit from, an individualized, tailored approach. And that's largely for reasons that are genetic, I think. At the same time, there are certain overarching principles that apply to almost everyone. So even though we don't want to be giving everyone the same bog standard treatment, and we also don't want to be treating things in a superficial manner, there are clearly overarching principles that make sense for everyone. So in the case of nutrition, from what I've looked at in the literature, it's obvious that largely human constructed foods containing extremely high amounts of carbohydrates and fats and not a lot of protein are probably adverse for the vast majority of people. And a diet containing a reasonable variety of different foods, which probably, again, ancestrally we tended to eat, is probably going to be more harmonious with our physiology. And that within that, eating quite a lot of protein is probably good for you. And any food that doesn't result in a wild destabilization of your blood sugar. It's probably good for your metabolism. So I think those are some really useful principles around nutrition, and then around mental health, all sorts of biological, psychological, and social things. The importance of connectedness socially, of good, deep, satisfying, intimate relationships, the importance of sleep, the importance of exercise, the importance of good nutrition. Psychologically, I think the importance of self-awareness and introspection, to take the time to figure out what is bothering you at a level that's not just superficial. And then obviously maintaining a good physical health. I mean, I don't think I've covered it with those, but there are overarching principles that seem to work with both.
The other thing that I've noticed is, whilst, as you say, there's a good deal that is known, some of which probably applies to everyone, some of which doesn't. My observation is, again as a layman, is that in both fields there's this great optimism around what isn't known, but that we might understand more deeply, and with possibly kind of revolutionary results in the next 10 to 20 years. And I like this idea of feeling that one's part of a kind of, a tiny part of an enormous community of sort of fellow inquirers. I feel that really strongly with the footage we're getting from I Hope This Helps. It's very inspiring to watch so many people kind of figuring things out, or trying to figure things out, and going through some really, really brutally difficult periods of life, and knowing that there isn't some magic solution that's, if only one just knew the right person to ask, it's so much more kind of complex and changing than that. But that there is, it does, I don't know, it feels to me like it's, both fields are at a kind of fascinating sort of moment in their history.
So right now you're in the process of getting footage, and how much footage have you received?
So yeah, I haven't really talked about the process of taking part, and obviously I'm hoping that as many people as possible all over the world do take part, and it's something that people would like to do. So we're receiving footage over the next 2 months, July and August, and so far we've received about 120 hours, 125 hours, I think. So we've been sort of beginning the process. Hopefully we'll receive much more, and out of that footage we'll try and make a film that is a kind of authentic response to the authentic material that we've received. We can only use a very small portion of it in the film, but it's kind of everything you get helps you understand what the planet is saying, I suppose.
It's kind of like a mosaic.
It's exactly like a mosaic, yeah.
And anyone can contribute to the film?
That's right. Anyone over the age of majority, wherever
they
live.
And what do you think, to any potential contributors listening, what do you think, what are you looking for in their contribution in their video clip?
Yeah, we try not to stipulate much, because it's really what people want to share. The most powerful footage doesn't have to be well filmed at all. It doesn't have to. It tends to feel very honest, authentic. It's really, we love meeting other people. So not, if you're just sending footage of yourself speaking, that's great. But it's also, fantastic to kind of go into someone's world. I've noticed as a viewer that you can always want to peek behind the curtain, just like basic things like, what do you have for breakfast? Where, where do you live? What's your neighbourhood like? Those kind of things. But mainly we're asking people to either take us with you in a day of your life, which we found works really well. It's a sort of lovely way of getting to know someone and kind of getting a sense of who someone is. Or, which probably is in some respects a simpler thing to do, is to talk about or show us what you do to manage your mental health. But we're pretty, as I said, we're pretty sort of free really about how people should take part. Whatever feels right for you is probably the best way.
Mm-hmm. A lot of mental health professionals listen to this podcast, And would you be looking for contributions from people who actually work in mental health, like nurses, therapists, psychiatrists,
yeah.
people in training?
I would absolutely love that. That would be brilliant. Yeah. I've been, again, I'm very conscious of being a layman, and I've been so kind of overwhelmed really by the work that people do in this field, and the kind of tenderness and the kind of disposition that people seem to have, I would love if the film could kind of capture that. It's either about what you think about things, or if possible, showing us, what you do in your daily life, what your life is like, and it would be brilliant.
In contributions you've seen so far, has there been much mention of the medical establishment, the use of medications, doctors, therapists, social workers, things like that?
Yeah, comes up a lot. It's a sort of almost not a cliche, but people say, remember to take your medicine. Is a sort of it's very, a lot of the footage is very sort of respectful, it's deferential, and then some of it's more kind of like critical, maybe people who feel let down. But it's a big, from lots of our contributors, it's a big part of it. From others, it's not mentioned at all. And I suppose that's, again, one of the things I find so interesting is the very different ways that people receive help or don't receive help. But also, language is the language people use is often very different from different parts of the world. I think one of the most exciting features of the project is that it's global. So far we've had footage from, I think, 88 different countries from all over the world, and hopefully we'll have even more. And just comparing what we have in common across the world, but also quite different ways in which this topic is understood and talked about. And as I said, it definitely extends to language. One of the things I've wondered is the extent to which, because of the way that we're mostly reaching people, which is through talking about the project on social media, to what extent are we limited by that to people who might already have a kind of particular shared language? I just don't know. You've seen bits and bobs of what we've received. What do you think?
I think a lot of the footage that I've seen, very much I recognize from my clinical experience, but there's part of me which wants to resist maybe what my clinical mind might do and just put things into categories. I think putting things into categories, which we do in my work all the time, can be very useful, but it can also suck the vitality out of something. I think looking at the footage holistically, what you look for is those glimmers of truth, which it's hard to actually articulate, and that's why you need to present it in a film form. And I think you talked earlier about the optimism that there's a sense of some mystery to mental health that we can start to discover, and in that discovery you can make things better for a lot of people. I think the first step in starting to unravel that mystery is through art. I think art is step one. It comes before more articulated forms of thought like philosophy and science. And so I think that's using technology in the way that you're using it to create, to provide these glimmers and these sparks of truth, which will eventually lead to helping us unraveling that mystery. That's, I think, that's the value that I see in the project. Does that make sense?
Well, I'm very interested by your theory around the staging of different disciplines, art first. But certainly when I watch the footage, I think it's a feeling of kind of recognition of oneself in someone else who you don't know from Adam, completely different part of the world, going through completely different things, and they do feel like sparks or glimmers of of truth. And that, it's nice to think of it in those terms, partly because it maybe takes some pressure off the weight of knowing how best to deploy the footage. Is not, I probably shouldn't get too sort of worked up about there's some sort of Aristotelian ideal sort of perfect from what we've received, because you're just trying to, we have a team of us watching the footage, putting the film together. You're just trying to respond in a faithful, honest way, and I like the way you put it. But explain more about this, starting with the arts as a way to make sense of something new.
I think art is the first step in trying to figure out something that we haven't figured out yet, because by definition with art you're trying to express something new that prior has not been has been unexpressible. And I think on the other side, having something finally articulated the way it's articulated in a textbook is kind of the final stage. It's kind of the difference. What I'm describing is kind of the difference between a painting and a textbook. A painting doesn't give you fine details, but it gives you a whole picture of something, a whole view of it. A textbook is the opposite. It gives you a lot of detail, but around something very specific. So although it's highly articulated, it lacks a whole global view of what it is that you're trying to describe. And so I think throughout the whole history of human progress, what you see is, I think art comes first, try to express something very mysterious. Philosophy comes second, which is trying to put concepts and ideas onto the art. And then science comes last, which is when you're using the very powerful mechanism of science to actually discern facts about objective reality. So in the case of mental health, you might depict someone's suffering through a novel, through a painting, through a poem, and then you might try to come up with some fancy ideas about what the origin of that suffering means, or the ways that suffering can actually be useful in someone's life, or might be a part of a stage of their life. And then science can help you further interrogate those ideas more deeply and see, is there actually truth to this? Is there replicability to this? Does it stand up to pressure testing, that kind of thing? Does that make sense?
I think so, yeah. I've noticed there are so many deep paradoxes in mental health, and I have been, if I'm honest, sort of overwhelmed by the mystery of mental health. And so maybe a sort of form that doesn't demand that you kind of declare with complete black and white binary conviction, well, this is how it is very important, because that wouldn't seem, that's not going to work in a field which is so kind of complex. It seems to me it's just, the more I understand, the more complicated I realise it is.
Yeah, and I think it's important not to resist that complexity. And I say this with regards to working on a project like yours, but also when I work with individuals. What I've noticed is there's so many different theories about what makes someone suffer from a mental health point of view, and those theories usually involve a description of potential causes and a description of potential solutions. So, for example, psychoanalysis might say a lot of mental suffering is because of unconscious forces which are repressed and which you're not aware of, and part of the solution is to become more conscious of those psychological forces, and there's truth in that. But what I've noticed is it's too easy, and I've seen lots of professionals fall into that trap, to fall in love with one particular model, say the psychoanalytic model or the medical model or the cognitive behavioral model. And I think we tend to fall in love with one model because it alleviates a deep sense of uncertainty which we all feel, and which makes us very anxious and angsty, especially when we're sitting across from someone in a lot of distress. And so having a model which helps you think about it alleviates a lot of that anxiety. But if you fall in love with one model and stick to it too dogmatically, it deadens the process, especially, for example, if you're a therapist working with a client and your client isn't fitting your model. If you're too attached to the model and you stop being attached to actually helping that client improve, it deadens something in the psychotherapeutic process. And you end up prioritizing your love of the model over your desire to helping the client improve their lives, which should be your fundamental orientation. This is the idea that the map is not the same as the territory. And maps can be really useful, but if you stick to just a map, which by definition is a subtraction of information, that's what makes a map really useful, is a lot of information is removed. If you fall in love with that map and you start to confuse that with the territory, then obviously you're missing a huge amount of information. So, for example, when I'm sitting opposite a client in therapy, I tend not to be thinking much about theory at all. I try not to think that much in general. I really just try and remain present. And if I react by saying something or doing something or proposing an intervention of some kind, I try and leave it more spontaneous. And then I do more thinking and theorizing in between sessions, and that might be involving different disciplines or different ways about thinking about a client and their psychology. But I think it's that combination of theory and thinking and then spontaneity and being more present focused that's really helpful. It's really a deadly combination because it's the best of both worlds. And I think that's one of the major problems I see within the mental health industry is people tend to be siloed into different, very specific ways of thinking and trying to solve all sorts of problems with just that way of thinking. And I think we would be better off if mental health professionals were trained more holistically. Not that this doesn't happen at all, but it's quite rare from what I've seen.
That's fascinating. Does it require multiple, potentially conflicting models kind of coexisting in some?
I think so. I think we should embrace the conflict of different disciplines and even the conflict between ourselves as individuals, because we don't tend to like conflict or disagreement. Again, it makes us unhappy. It flares up that sense of anxiety and uncertainty, which makes us very anxious. But if you think about it, the source of progress is disagreement and conflict. The source of progress is, this jigsaw piece doesn't fit with the rest of the puzzle, and therefore we need to think about this a bit differently. That's what keeps things alive and dynamic, is disagreement. It's, my theory about reality doesn't seem to be working because I'm not getting the feedback from reality that I necessarily want. So I have to adapt and do something different. And we've always done that as human beings. We've always figured out how do we adapt ourselves to our ever-changing reality in order to get what we want. So, like I said to you before, the complexity of what we're facing shouldn't be resisted. In fact, I think it's actually very peaceful to have a more, in a Buddhist sense, non-resistant attitude, because then the problems that need to be solved, rather than being a source of distress, become actually the source of energy and vitality. It's wonderful, really, to have a bottomless problem to solve, in some sense. Not that you obviously want to be making progress, but by having a problem that you're always trying to solve and always get a little bit better at solving, that's why I like therapy, because you're never going to be there's no such thing as being a therapist that's 100% effective. There's no real end goal. It's really just the art of talking to people and listening to them in a way that improves their lives by their definition.
Yeah.
And you can always be getting a little bit better at that.
Yeah.
So it makes it a very wonderful pursuit in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Yeah, I've been interested how often, again, mental health as a very broad topic kind of inevitably collides into other enormous philosophical questions particularly around the concept of free will, or the extent to which we, as individuals, have true agency, and how those kind of ideas coexist with cultural, societal, like massive kind of underlying sort of demographic features of our existence and makeup. It's almost I feel like you can't really hide with mental health.
Explain that a little more.
You I guess that's probably why I'm in awe of people working in this field, is that it seems to me very difficult to sort of put on a pair of blinkers and tackle a very specific problem, because the sort of breadth of it as a topic I find very kind of dizzying. I often feel sort of woozy thinking about these things because they are so complex. So I suppose it makes me more like in awe of people who are able to pull their sleeves up and get on with it and make a positive difference.
Yeah, and I think there's healthier and more dysfunctional ways of going about it, because it is difficult. And I've seen many different ways that clinicians try and cope really with the stresses of working in mental health. I think one of the things that's worked for me is to develop really a personal philosophy around mental health, and to come face to face with the idea that everyone is vulnerable. Everyone's vulnerable physically, but everyone's vulnerable in the sense of their mental health as well. I think when we're faced opposite people who are suffering in some way, it makes us incredibly fearful that the same thing is going to happen to us, and it brings to the fore a lot of denial mechanisms, and that's what creates a lot of stigma, I think, and a lot of distance and a lot of siloing of people who have mental health problems, because if they're, as long as we can cordon them off and put them somewhere else, that reduces the fear that the same thing could very much happen to us, which of course it does. But I think if you allow yourself to come to the understanding that you are just as vulnerable as anyone else, and you really face it and really think about it and really are grateful for what you do have, then I think the opposite things happens, where when you're dealing with people who have their problems, I almost see it as a little vaccination, in the sense that you become better at dealing with difficulty, with suffering, with darkness, so that then when you do face it in your own life, it's a little bit easier actually, because you're more grounded in that experience of seeing what suffering looks like and not being so terrified of it.
Yeah, I think that makes perfect sense. It's something I really hope we can share from this project, is the effect of watching this kind of testimony just does have this kind of calming, quite reassuring sense of a kind of collective vulnerability and recognizing yourself in other people and feeling okay about it. And something I've noticed in I looked at lots of documentary films about mental health, and there are some absolutely amazing films, but there's a very interesting temptation, I think, for a filmmaker, which is to be drawn to things that are quite extreme or shocking or surprising or funny or sort of, in inverted commas, weird. And the thing about this project that I've found is that all of that is kind of, it's very disarming to watch the opposite, which is just someone saying, this is who I am. It's very difficult not to, kind of be very moved by the footage, and I do hope the film can be a kind of little vaccine, as you say, against the sort of wanting to stigmatize, particular conditions or whatever it is. I think when we started, I slightly naively, very, very naively thought, well, because the conversation around mental health has changed so much in the last 10 years that it's almost a bit passé to worry about stigma.
Oh, yeah. Well, it is and it isn't. I think a lot of more common mental health conditions like depression and anxiety have been destigmatized. But I think there's still a lot of stigma around more serious conditions like bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, psychosis, drug-induced psychosis, personality difficulties. I think that remains pretty stigmatized. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that some of the most arresting footage we've received, it's quite a broad range of conditions. It's not, it's certainly not just, it's certainly not only anxiety and depression that we're getting footage about. And also, obviously, I realise that in different parts of the world, there's great variance in terms of this, destigmatising trend. And also, obviously, I think this goes back to what I was trying to say about the kind of collective journey of inquiries. There's a lot of uncertainty. That's what I see a lot of in the footage, is like kind of, and confusion, and all of us in different ways having experienced things that are terrifyingly mysterious and feeling that one's doing that, on one's own. And I suppose that's why the spark of connection you get when you see someone else in a similar or not similar, but kind of in some respects comparable situation is so moving. And I do think again it's a paradox of these films, I suppose, that in a way they're so boring. They're so they're about things that are utterly unexceptional, and that's what I find is so powerful about them, so moving, is that they're not reliant on extremely strange things that happen in to other people. They're about ordinary human experience in lots of ways, which I hope is why it's a good kind of approach to try and apply to this field. Not we'll see if it works. I hope it does. Yeah. I mean, were you starting, because Life in a Day 2020 was happening during the pandemic, were you starting to get a flavour of people sending in footage where there was some sort of description or expression of what was going on with people's mental health? That's a very good question, because I don't know if that's we had more footage in 2020 than any other film that I can think of. Actually, we got quite a lot for Britain in a Day, which is 2011, of people talking around things that one might, term as coming under the umbrella of mental health. I don't know if it was because of the pandemic per se, or just because it was 2020 and not 2010. Yeah. I mean, for what it's worth, if you look back at Life and Day 2010, it feels like a very different time, obviously, but it's very sort of optimistic. What are the differences? On July 24th, 2010, a horrendous accident happened at a festival in Germany called Love Parade, where it was one of those kind of awful kind of crushes, people being crushed. And that was a very difficult moment in the film, and it was part of a sequence that in some respects sort of confected of fear, a sort of kind of the darker period of the film. But it was a sort of feat of editing, because the footage we got by and large was cheerful people having a very cheery Saturday, doing fun things and hanging out with friends and family. And I think I happen to think that's what most days on the planet are like for most people. That's right. And that's why it felt quite radical, even though, as I said, it's just utterly banal, everyday stuff. And Life in Day 2020, there was no need to use, brilliant editing skills to create that sense. It was coming from the stories that were being told. And mental health definitely did. Yeah. Well, something I've always been curious about, I'm always curious about careers where there's not necessarily a clearly defined path. Like I trained in medicine, which is a very clearly defined path. How do you become a film producer? How does that happen?
There are lots of different ways in. It's quite difficult even to sort of describe what a film producer does, and there are lots of different ways of doing it. But when I left university, I was told about the National Film and Television School, which I'd never heard of, and I suppose I didn't really know enough about the film industry to know what one might do to get into it, I suppose, really. But it was also all I'd ever wanted to do, so I met someone who met someone else who'd been to the National Film and Television School and said I should definitely apply. I spent 2 years there, and it gave me this amazing... In a way, it felt like a cheat, because I was sort of faintly plausible when I left, and I was completely implausible when I arrived, I suppose. So it kind of... Although I learnt lots of things about how to make films and how to produce films, at least on paper, you produce a bit, but a lot of it is you're learning about what you're then supposed to go on and do. The main benefit for me was to kind of give me a kind of, I suppose, confidence, degree of confidence, and sort of understand the kind of idioms of the film industry and the way that people talk about stories. And so I then went to work in film development, which is the way that a project goes from an idea to a whole thousands of people assemble to turn it into a film. So it was all about your stories and ideas, working with writers. Yeah, it gave me this very plausible grounding. So lots of my peers, I suppose the majority of them didn't go to film school and maybe came up as, at the start you often start as an assistant to a producer or working within a production company. Yeah, I think maybe it allowed me to sort of bluff more convincingly, I suppose. So yeah, I went via film schools.
Yeah. What do you enjoy the most about the process of making films?
Well, I'm really bad at making decisions, which is a terrible failing, really, for people in film. I mean, most people are very good at making decisions in film, I suspect. So the areas that I enjoyed the most were in development, where you're just thinking and talking and wondering,
hypothesizing.
I suppose so. Yeah. Someone told me about a lecture that David Hare gave, where he talked about why the writer is the sort of enemy.
Why is the writer the enemy?
So, I'm probably getting it wrong, but this is the bit that I've chosen to remember because I really connected with it, which is that before a writer turns in a draft, there are quite often quite a number of other stakeholders, in inverted commas, people who are kind of invested in the project, either because they've invested money or emotionally invested, or they've worked in it. So when as a writer you deliver your draft, you've made contingent all of the things that up until that point existed dreamily in the minds of all these so-called stakeholders. And so by committing these notions into a 120-page document, you're in that very moment kind of destroying the dream of the rest of us, the fools around it, who've got these inchoate, very, sort of loose and probably ill thought out imaginings of this amazing thing that you're going to...
Of what should happen in the story.
Yeah, and probably don't even need to... It doesn't even need to be that precise. It's just, it's something completely wonderful because it's about this, and there's this amazing character who's going to do this, and it's going to be hugely exciting. Mm-hmm. And so the poor writer is condemned to, destroying those dreams by committing to one particular story with one particular set of characters, and on the end of every page, only one thing is the thing that's being said is the thing that's being said.
Yeah.
And so I probably enjoyed the bit right at the beginning. Yeah.
What do you think, from your experience, makes a compelling story?
All that matters is that you want to know what's going to happen next, I think. And in order to have a handle on what it is that might happen next, a writer and attendant, bods, directors, editors, actors, everyone is working together to give the audience just enough to chew on. And if there's too much going on, if there's too much uncertainty about what you're focused on, you aren't going to care about what happens next. And if it's too predictable or obvious, then what happens next is less interesting.
So there's like a balance to achieve between predictability and unpredictability.
That's my view. I think that's where drama is entirely analogous to sport, or indeed lots of other games generally, where a game of pure chance is the most boring game in the world, and a game of no chance, where it's entirely predictable and logical what would happen next, is also a terrible game. And it seems that somehow drama and sport and games sit in this kind of magical place where, as humans, we've just enough means to be kind of hooked into the question of what's going to happen next. I read something very interesting about the constraints of a sitcom, which I think kind of maybe relate to this, which is in a sitcom, you know the characters so well that you're very often enjoying what you know is going to happen.
You enjoy the predictability.
Well, I couldn't agree to that because that would disprove what I've been saying. But so
Well, I think just to reconcile it, I think drama and sitcoms serve very different functions within entertainment. I think people look to drama for thrills and exhilaration and novelty, and I think people look to watch sitcoms for comfort and familiarity and a sense of a homecoming. And that's why I think people watch things in very different frames of mind. Like the frame of mind you have when you're going to watch the new drama at the cinema is very different from when you binge a sitcom when your life's not in a very good place and you actually need something a bit more comforting. That's how I've come to think about it.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think I agree. I mean, the point I was going to make about a sitcom is that because you are excited about what's going to happen next. But what I've noticed sitcoms often do is they will kind of heavily constrain the variables in play. So in a sitcom like Friends, you're not worrying about nuclear war,
no,
or
whether they're going to be friends by the end.
That's right. There's a whole set of things which the people making the program are saying, don't worry about this in the slightest. There's only going to be 3 or 4 things we should be worrying about in this episode. And you don't really, in the case of a sitcom, need to particularly worry about how a character is going to change, because broadly speaking, in most sitcoms, characters don't change throughout, series to series. So I was really only trying to sort of support the point that there is, in my view, a kind of carefully calibrated presentation of things that one can, usefully wonder about in terms of what's going to happen next, and not. And I do, and I agree that. Well, I think one of the reasons that certainly I find sitcoms so comforting is that even in quite sort of nihilistic sitcoms, it's not really. It's a very kind of safe universe, I'd say. Yeah, with sort of safe rules.
When I think of nihilistic sitcom, I think of Seinfeld. Do you mean a show like Seinfeld or something?
Yeah, I mean, I think Seinfeld is the greatest sitcom.
Oh, okay, you're a Seinfeld fan.
And it purports to be nihilistic. Or I mean, I know that's not the same as being a show about nothing. But they're not supposed. The characters don't change, and they don't. And they're supposed to be awful. I mean, I love all the characters in Seinfeld, but they are, on paper at least, utterly despicable people.
Well, I mean, so that's the interesting thing about a lot of television is, and I think a lot of the best TV shows exemplify this, they're despicable people, and if you were to meet them in real life, you'd have a terrible experience, but you love to watch them and be alongside them. So you've got characters of Seinfeld, which many people regard as one of the best, if not the best sitcom of all time. You've got Walter White in Breaking Bad. You've got James Gandolfini in The Sopranos. You've got Dr. House. You've got all these characters who, if you were to interact with them one-on-one, you'd hate it, probably. You'd have a bad time. But we're willing to be alongside them for hours and hours and hours.
I think that's right, yeah. And again, with it, yeah, in these characters, there's very interesting sort of different degrees of redeemability, I suppose. When I was at film school, we were given a talk about why The Office was so revolutionary, and I remember the argument being made that David Brent was he was utterly irredeemable, or rather, it was very difficult to feel any kind of sympathy for him at all in the sort of language of a sitcom. Whereas I remember them citing things like Fawlty Towers, where although Basil Fawlty is awful, very often his wife is worse. I mean, that's a contentious thing to say, but it's often being set up where Basil, you feel for Basil because of the humiliation that he's experiencing, often of his own creation, but it's often to do with how he relates to other. I love the sitcom Curb Your Enthusiasm, and I can't often watch it with my wife because she sees so much of the Larry David character in me, and it makes her get very sort of angry towards me for something that he's doing. But what I've noticed distinguishes different episodes is that if there's an episode where there is a kind of more egregious villain, then I'm sort of off the hook.
Okay.
Whereas if it's just Larry David himself being the most despicable character in an episode, I get it in the neck.
Do you find, when you personally watch The Office, could you sympathise with David Brent? Because I felt like I could.
100%. Yeah, absolutely. And I actually think that's why I think quite kind of deficient, wicked characters are often very cathartic to watch, is because we are sanctioned, so probably privately, to relate to them and their pretensions and their things they do and say that we would be too ashamed to do and say but probably feel. So I think that's maybe one reason why such a character is such a kind of valuable kind of dramatic construct. Yeah. In the same way, I mean, it's I'm not really a horror fan, but I find it fascinating why horror is such an enduringly popular genre. Why do you go to the cinema to sort of be punished for 90 minutes by seeing an ever more horrendous series of things happening? And there must be a kind of cathartic component to it.
Cathartic component to seeing those extremes of aggression and distress and fear. Yeah, there's something that is very difficult to articulate about it. Most of the time, unlike other films, it's the total absence of propaganda or an explicit or implicit message about what we should or should not be doing, but it's just there's something, like you said, something very cathartic about it. I think and it has a lot of symbolic imagery and symbolic meaning that makes it quite different to a drama film, I think.
Yeah, when I was talking about drama, I guess I meant drama in the widest possible sense. But sure, yes, I know what you mean, yeah.
Like a character drama.
Yeah. Although, again, it depends on the filmmaker. A filmmaker like Haneke makes lots of films which are unrelentingly... You feel... Not that the audience is being punished, but the audience isn't being let off the hook. Whereas I think most films wrap things up.
There's some sort of reconciliation. That's
right. And that's probably what I yearn for in a film is
reconciliation.
Well, it's the idea that the universe is just and things will be all right in the end. And I certainly think that's the case with the Haneke film, is that you're not being allowed to feel that.
What has he made?
He's made gazillions of great films, a particularly brilliant film called White Ribbon. The one I'm thinking of, I forget the name of it, but Funny Games. At about 60 minutes into the film, there's a completely brutal, sort of unmotivated, irrational beating. And I remember the character looking up at the camera and saying to the audience, "Don't you realise we're only 60 minutes in or something? The film isn't going to end here. We have to, it's playing with exactly what we're..."
Breaking the fourth wall.
Yeah, he's an absolutely brilliant filmmaker.
Yeah. What are some of your other favourite films or filmmakers?
Well, my favourite film is a comedy called Clockwise, starring John Cleese.
Clockwise.
Which isn't probably a very highly thought of film. It's a farce written by Michael Frayn. Yeah, I like all sorts of films. Different. I suppose that's what I love about cinema. Is there's so many different. I used to go to Cannes Film Festival, every year. It always struck me as a kind of quasi-religious experience of thousands of people coming together to sort of venerate films, and slightly more distastefully filmmakers, and a lot of people working in film take film terribly seriously, and Cannes is it's the apotheosis of that, and something I really love about the film industry, I think.
Yeah,
how seriously it's taken
with a religious intensity.
There's a practice of hundreds of films are premiered in Cannes every year, but the films that people are most sort of excited about are those which are officially selected to play in the various competitions, and the different competitions, or it's all quite esoteric, and there's a very interesting history about the different sections. But the main section, competition, there's a press screening at 8 a.m. and you have to get there. The rules are absurdly strict about when you have to arrive and your tickets and what you have to wear and all this stuff. And it's an enormous cinema, and so I don't know how many people it fits thousands, but it feels like 10,000, but I assume it's not 10,000. So everyone files in at about 7:30, like hastily trying to finish off a croissant, because they're probably not allowed to eat a croissant inside, in these funny queues. And people are quite kind of bleary because people go to bed very late. It's quite a sort of wild place, Cannes. And people from all over the world sit and watch a film that no one on the planet has seen before. And the experiences people are having in that cinema are, I think they're quite different. I mean, quite different from the experience that people might have watching exactly the same film in a different context. And people, I went to a screening of a film called Brown Bunny. I think that was about 11:30 at night, and it was just intermittently booed, and people were screaming. There was a scene with a character brushing his teeth, and people started clapping, sort of ironically. I remember going to a screening of Marie Antoinette, that was an American.
Kirsten Dunst.
That's right, directed by Sofia Coppola, and it's a very important French figure directed by an American, and the film was got a really horrible reaction, and really sort of, you think, what, and how can people be getting so worked up? And then the most moving film I saw, I remember seeing in that 8 o'clock slot was a film called Diving Bell and the Butterfly. If you know about,
I think I've read the book.
Yeah. It's an, well, I say it's an absolutely brilliant film. I've only watched it once in that context, and I remember it as being an absolutely brilliant film. It would be interesting to know if it actually is, or whether it's the kind of this environment. But yeah, it's kind of all these people streaming out at 9:30 in the morning in tears, and this sort of sense of connection you feel with all people from all over the world who've come together to venerate this especially sort of devout, often quite kind of pious form. It's really interesting, I think.
Wow. Yeah, it must be such an interesting environment to explore. conscious of your time. I'm aware that you've listened to this podcast before, and sometimes it can be hard to get critical feedback. So if I had to put you on the spot for a second, you've listened before. What do you think could make this podcast better?
I don't know, a different host. No, just more episodes. I was struggling away. I mean, I still struggle away with this project, and I love listening to this podcast. I think, I mean, there's never a new. It feels very varied, and to me, it feels very varied. You always seem to find, apart from me, you always seem to find very interesting people with quite different perspectives to talk to, and I love the conversations that I hear. So I suppose the more varied, the better. I think it was very odd to me that it was such a struggle to feel I had any access to kind of live philosophical conversations around the topic. So yeah, that's I think why I was so kind of. I remember the first episode I heard was I was particularly sort of I was fretting on a Saturday morning, and it was by chance, and I binged on your podcast all weekend.
Well, thank you. Flattery will get you nowhere. Maybe you can give me some critical feedback offline. If people want to contribute to I Hope This Helps, where should they go? How can they do that?
They should go to visit ihopethishelpsfilm.com as soon as they can, and watch. We've done a little call-out trailer and a little introductory video, and hopefully that's the best way to explain for us to explain like what we're trying to do. And yeah, obviously anyone who'd like to take part, we would love it.
Perfect. Jack, thanks very much for coming on.
Thank you very much.
You are listening to the Thinking Mind podcast. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed it, please share it with a friend or give us a rating. It really does help people to find us. If you find the podcast valuable, why not buy us a coffee to help keep us going? There's a link in the show notes. As ever, we love to hear from you and love to hear what you think. So drop us an email or get in touch on social media. Thank you so much.